Most of you, I know you from before, otherwise a few new people. I'm David Schleper. I grew up in Shakopee starting when I was 2 years old until I was 18. Then I headed out, went from the East Coast to the West Coast to Hawaii to Australia to Colorado, back to DC, and then finally I eventually ended up back here taking care of my mom who had Alzheimer's, and ended up moving back here for good a few years ago now. And so I've been very interested in the history of Shakopee. And so today the Shakopee Heritage Society wanted to look at specifically the churches in Shakopee when they started and some of the progressions over time. There are two papers that were on the table if you didn't get them, but they just have information if you need them, and it's on the table by there. There's also coffee and water, it looks like. Okay, so we're going to talk about churches, and I think the most interesting one, is the first one, and this is the Sioux Mission of St. Francis Xavier. And this was the first Catholic church. It was actually a log cabin here in Shakopee, and it was never used. And that makes it kind of interesting. All right. We know that it was moved here from another place, okay, to Ttäkpe, which is the name of the Dakota village here in Shakopee. There were 600 people who were living here. And they moved here in the area near Memorial Park, probably a little bit closer to the village of Shakopee, what eventually became there in probably 1853, 1854.
Is that where the burial grounds were?
Where the yeah, but it was further before that, but that's the same area, yes. The Ttäkpe has been here in Shakopee since 1690 or so. It was on the north side of the river, and then 1839 it moved to the south side of the river, which is the other side, and they moved a little bit around that area, but there were about 600 Dakota Indians who lived there since 1690 and lived here. Even when Thomas Holmes came, there was already a village here. So, okay. And we know that it was started, this church was started by Father Augustine Ravu, I guess. I don't know if I can say the name right, but that's all right. You guys know I had a stroke, so sometimes I can't say the words, but it's in my mind, it's right. All right. So just go with the flow with that, all right? All right. We know that he was, this priest was born in France, and 7 of them came to America. I know they came to Iowa area, Dubuque, I think. And we know that he was ordained in 1840. So we do know that is definitely choice. But what happens is when he was there, they asked him to go further north, in other words, to what was the Minnesota Territory, and to look and see if they wanted to do a mission for the Indians. And they came to St. Peter's River, which is the name of the Minnesota River at that time. And they found Catholic families in this area, in Mendota, which was, at that time, was the Iowa Territory, and right across the river at Fort Snelling, which is in Wisconsin Territory. So, they kept moving those names around a lot, so it got a little bit confusing. But basically, those are basically what is now in Minnesota. All right. And so there were summer planting villages that the Dakotas had all along the river. And specifically, Little Rapids, which was, you know where Little Rapids is? It's in Carver County, okay? And Tinta Otanwa, which is Shakopee's village. And those two are important because what happened is the church was built here at Little Rapids, and then when they all moved to Shakopee, the Dakota did, they took the cabin there, they took it apart, and they moved it over to Shakopee. And it's the village of the Barrier of Stone. On top is how you would pronounce it if you were Dakota. Okay. And as you can see, I'm not going to pronounce it. So that's sad, really, because I know I should in theory, but you know, I just know it's not going to come out anyway. So, all right. So we know that there was a fur trading post in Little Rapids, and it's important because John Baptiste Faribault arrived in 1803. He met his wife, who was part Dakota. They got married, okay, and they moved out, but then they kept coming back here, and with their sons, they would move to the area of Little Rapids. So you have John Baptiste Faribault, okay, and his wife. And then they had their son David, who will eventually live in Shakopee for 3 years, and his wife, who is Winona Nancy McClure Faribault Huggins, okay? And they will live in Shakopee for a while. There's Oliver Faribault, and they did the first log cabin that was built in Shakopee. Okay, there's no picture of him. He died when he was 35. And his wife was Walking Yankee, and they lived in Shakopee, and she ended up dying here in Shakopee. Okay, and then there's Alexander Faribault and his wife. And Alexander is the one who did the city of Faribault in Minnesota, okay? So he was kind of the Shakopee person, Faribault person, and he was also in Shakopee. He was all over the place, okay? But it's important that they, as a group, were living at Little Rapids during certain times over the years. And so remember that the priest came there, and he spent the winter of 1842 and 1843 with the Faribaults at the Little Prairie. Okay, and in that process, this guy, remember, he's from France. He spoke French. The Faribault family could speak French, and they could speak Dakota, and they could speak pretty good English, okay? But probably the most common, amongst the family, they mostly spoke with the mother was Dakota, and they mostly spoke Dakota, but they also could speak French, okay? And so the priest comes there, and they said, okay, great, so we're going to teach them how to learn Dakota. And he learned it, okay? And he said that the Dakota was much harder than learning Latin and Greek. Well, I'm not good at Latin, I'm not good at Greek, and I'm sure not good at Dakota, so, but I believe they're probably right. All right. And so it's interesting because the father wrote in 1842, he said, a few days later, I was induced by the Faribault families, but most especially by that old and respectable gentleman, John Baptiste Faribault, to spend the winter with him and two of his sons, Oliver and David, both married at Casca, which is Little Prairie. He had a trading post there for the Indians of Shakopee and also for the Sioux of another village of Carver, which was Little Rapids. Okay, so we know that this was happening. Now this is not in Shakopee, but it's close by, right? And he said that it was most pleased to be with them, for they loved the Indians, of course, remember, Oliver and David were part Dakota Indian, because remember, the mother was half Dakota Indian. So they were both about 1/4 Dakota Indians. John Baptiste Faribault was not, but his wife was, and the children would be, okay? And they said they spoke equally with French, English, and Sioux languages. They were good interpreters and very useful for me in translating his book into the Sioux language. And so while he was there during that winter time, he actually learned the language of the Dakota. I don't know how good he was, but he was able to do it. And he ended up doing this book, okay? It's called The Path of the House of God. Notice how I just switch over that's just so you know, that's how bad it is, okay. But we do know that it was in French, and he translated it into Dakota with the help of Alexander, Oliver, and David Faribault, okay? So they had that there and they used that. And while they were there, John Baptiste Faribault, who's a very strong Catholic person, said he wanted to have a permanent Roman Catholic mission in the site, in Little Prairie. And so they built a small cabin near the Faribault compound at Little Prairie, okay? So we know that was true. But then what's interesting, we know that it was constructed and operated. And then what happened is that Oliver married Wankanyanki, which is also known as Harriet Faribault eventually, okay? Okay, and when they did, they decided to move to Tinta Otanwe, or in Shakopee area, okay? And of course, because some of them had that French influence, they also called it the French Prairie, this area. So really complex things, because everybody calls their own place names everything different. So it's Tinta Otanwe. It's also called the French Prairie. It's also called Prairieville. And eventually, after several other names, because there were 8 of them altogether, they ended up calling it Shakopee. And they know that the church itself was 15 by 30 feet, okay? And they think it was probably similar to the Faribault trading posts, because this is a very similar design that they did, okay? But we don't really know where it was. What we do believe is, even from there and moving over to the Shakopee area, we know that it was probably very close to where the Faribault log cabin trading post was. And you know where that is located? If you don't, remember Dangerfields right now, downtown? Right across from there is where the Faribault trading post was, okay? It used to be, more recently, there was a greenhouse there, right? And before that was actually the log cabin. The log cabin now is at the landing in Shakopee. The house is now torn down, and it's going to be just prairie there, because there are some graves there also. And so that's going to stay there. And then right next to that is the pond cabin, and that's not there anymore, but the foundation is still there. And that whole area is now part of the history park that we're working on also. Okay. And so they moved to Shakopee. And these are the second and third Shakopee, okay? So this is Shakopee 2, and this is Little 6, okay? So we know that when Oliver Faribault and Wankanyanki moved here, the priest moved chapel, because it was in Little Rapids, but no one was there anymore because they all moved. So he moved it over here. And again, we don't know exactly where it is, but we know it's somewhere, I think is probably closer where Dangerfield's area was, is probably my guess, but I don't know. But we do know that the Dakota Indians did not like it, did not want it. And so they said, if it's there and it's running, we'll burn it down. And so the priest said, I'm going to get rid of it, okay? So they take it apart, they move it to the German Catholics of Wabasha in 1844. It's interesting, if you see that Wabasha is spelled with an H at the end, it was that for a few more years until they finally took that off. So I would leave it there. Okay, and the priest left in 1844 and never returned to this area. So there is a church here. It's gone. It was only here for a short time. And we don't really know much about it other than that. Okay, it's just interesting that it is. And we do know that it was placed on a raft and moved down on the river, St. Peter's River. It was moved to Wabasha in 1844. They said it was used, but not really regularly, but it was used. And then eventually it was used for a newspaper publishing company in the building and a schooling. And now there's we don't know anything more about it than that. Okay, so that's the first really church that was built in Shakopee. The second one is the Pond Mission. And that was from about 1847 to 1853. And this picture you see here, it's not the best picture, but that was from the, in the Central Elementary School. Before that it was the Union School way back, right? And it used to be a library there. There's a mural that was painted during the Depression area time. It's on the wall there, and that has that picture there, and I kind of just like the picture of that. Okay, but we do know that for 6 years, starting in 1847, the Indians gathered in various numbers each Sabbath to learn the white man's religion, and the little children had gathered each day for religious instruction. So we do know that that was true. Now we don't know the amount of people that were there, but we do know that there weren't a lot of Dakota that went to that church. It was really in the house itself. And we do know that there was a person, Roundwing was his name. He at one point, their children were there and they took him out and said, "Get out, you can't be in there." So we do know that. And we know that Reverend Samuel Pond, he said, "I have great hope that I will see many of the Indians converted, but faithful missionaries in different parts of the world have spent their lives without seeing any fruits of their labors. And what am I better than they?" And we do know that Samuel Pond, as a person, he really realized when he first arrived here to Minnesota area, he knew that he wanted to, if he really wants to convert the Dakotas, he needed first to really learn the language. And so he spent lots of time. They'd have hunting for 3 months, and he'd go and live with them. And so he'd learn the language, and he learned so much, so he ended up, they say that he was probably the best white man on speaking the language of the Dakotas. And he actually made like a dictionary really of the thing, which eventually got published. And it's really important that he really was important for a way to document it, development of Dakotas at that time. All right, the next church that pops up is St. Peter's Episcopal Church. And that was here in Shakopee from 1854 to 1921. You know, last night when I was getting ready for this, I couldn't find where it's located. Does anybody know? I do know that I think it was on 3rd Street, but I can't remember the cross street. Okay. I will find out, but I just don't know right now. So just, you know, I was like looking through all my books and I couldn't find it. So we do know that Reverend Greenleaf, who was a missionary in Stillwater, moved to Shakopee. At that time, the name of the place was Shakopee, Minnesota Territory. And he and his wife, they built a shanty in the spring of 1854. And while he was there, he was a lay minister, but he started the church. And eventually, well, he said, it seems much like going into the wilderness when I came here. It appeared to me that they ought to at least have one missionary in the valley of the Minnesota. Well, actually, that's kind of a stupid thing because Samuel Pond is already there. So there is a missionary there. But anyway, here's another one. All right. And we do know that the cornerstone of the church was built May 17th, 1854. And we know that Daniel Storer started the building of the building, I guess, in the fall of 1854. And the Reverend left in 1854, in November. But others replaced, so there were several. What's interesting, though, is that over time there wasn't a very good documentation of what happened with this church, but we do know that it was really technically one of the first true church that was there. And we know that in the 1920s, they no longer had a minister that worked with them, and they had very few services. And then at some point, we think in 1921, the church was torn down and finished. So that's just an interesting, again, the problem is we weren't there, so we can't really remember what it looked like, but we do have the picture that we had that was early that shows what it looked like, and we do know that it was there. The other one that's kind of ties into Samuel Pond is the First Presbyterian Church. Okay, and that was at 502 First Avenue East. I write those on just so I can help remember myself, but okay. We know that the territory itself was open for the white men to come in 1852. And many settlers arrived at this area, which at that time was called Prairieville. And that was really what was Tinta Otonwa means prairie village. So that's where it turned into Prairieville. They said at one point there were like 30 people landed at the old landing at the foot of Holmes Street on a single day. So a lot of people were coming in. And so the first preaching service to white people in Shakopee occurred at the old mission house, again, in other words, Pond's house, in the month of June 1854. And then the church kind of moved around. So it was in the mission house, but it got so many people, okay? So then they went to Henry Hines, and he had a law office that was being built. So it wasn't finished yet, so they moved there, so people would go there for church. And then when that was busy becoming a thing, they moved to the upper floor of Holmes Hall. And then after that, they moved into various private homes and in barns. So moved around for a while they're trying to figure out what to do. And then we do know that the First Presbyterian Church Well, we knew that the Thomas Holmes and Daniel Storer, that's the pictures, that's Daniel, and that's Thomas Holmes. They had a dance at Holmes Hall for a benefit for the church. And they gave them money to them. I want to say it was like $61 or something. You know, it's like, woo. But that was a lot at that time, I think. And they used that. And, but it is kind of just interesting in terms of that. And so from them, they built the church. And Samuel Pond, after this, talks about remembering that first church. Okay. And I like that, you know, it wasn't the most comfortable church probably, but it was very popular. And then finally, the first church, which is second in the valley. My opinion, third, because remember the one that was the Catholic church that was there but never used. Don't know if you count that or not, but anyway, was built in the fall of 1856. It was a frame building, and it's interesting because Samuel Pond himself built the church. In other words, it wasn't like a lot of people or a company or anything like that. He was actually building most of it. And it was on 2nd Street and Market Street, combo, okay, so that's where it was located. And it was used by about 180 people. And they later added a fence and a horse shed. And the horse shed, and that was on Main and Market Street. Okay, so you got to think yourself through what the thing is. Okay, and then they moved it. In 1899, they built a new church on 1st Street and Fillmore Street. And it cost $2,560. It is kind of funny when you think about the amount, the cost, you know, and you think about how much it costs now to do something like that. It's kind of interesting. But we know that the lot itself was donated by Henry Hines. It was dedicated on February in 1900. And the bell from the old building was brought over and used. And they added 2 stained glass windows. One was for Samuel Pond, and the other was for his wife, Cordelia Eggleston Pond. I wish we had those stained glass things, but obviously we don't. Okay. But it looked like that. All right. And we know that the church stayed in the building from 1900 to 1967. And then they moved somewhere else, and I'll tell you where in a minute. But when they left, the church became a bus terminal. So some of you may remember that. And then it became kind of an office building. And then in 1997, it became a new church. Notice how Dave is not going to notice. There's what it looks like now, and they're there now still, okay? And the translation of what that is, okay, it's called the Church of the Living God, Column of Truth, the Light of the World, okay? And they say that it's, I've gone over to them, I haven't been in, but I know that they were delivered in Spanish, and most of the people who go there are probably Hispanic. I remember this building only because my mom, at that time she was still living at home, but she was starting to kind of lose her mind, and once in a while she used to go to church at St. Mary's. And then when she'd go home, she got confused to how to get home. It was only 2 blocks away, but she was confused. And she ended up being downtown, right at that church. And so she went to the person, she must have asked or didn't know what to do. And luckily the person there, the pastor, took her to St. Mark's, brought her there. So that was good. So I was so happy, because we were very worried, with something like that to happen. then eventually we decided that wasn't a good place for Mom to be there by herself. But anyway, and just so you know that, so this is again the church that is downtown now. You can see it now on First Avenue. Okay. Now, meanwhile, the First Presbyterian Church moved to on Marshall Road, like 9th and Marshall Road. Okay. So it's just kind of interesting the different things that happen within this. The next one is a very short one, a little one here, but the Shakopee Baptist Church was built in 1854. It was moved, for the most part, they moved into different houses or different halls or whatever for a short time. They never really had a building. They said at one point they had some land, but they didn't ever build a church. And that's all we know about that one. There are other Baptist churches later, but at this point this was it. But it's just added because we do know that 1854 it was. The next one was St. Mary's Church of the Purification, which is in Marystown. And that was in 1855. I'm going to go kind of quick on this, but it was a log cabin church first in Marystown. But it was burnt before it was completed. So a second church was built and finished in 1856. And then a stone church was built in 1870. And they enlarged it a little bit too. And then finally, the final church, the one that's still there now, was built in 1882. It's interesting, again, they had another fire there. So they had a lot of problems with fire in Marystown, just FYI. I'm not saying anything else, but anyway. But anyway, it was destroyed, but it was okay enough that they were able to continue to rebuild. Okay, and so that's that one there. And then the next one is St. Mark's Catholic Church. That was built in 1856. That's the one most people see when you come into town because it has such a big building. But it's interesting. It started in 1856 on January 1st, and they were at this house, Anton and Lizette Schmidt's Entrup house, which is on 1st and Atwood at that time. That's where the first service happened, okay? And then what happened is then they built the land. They built the land, they bought the land for $250, and they built a native limestone church for $986.50 in 1856. It's about 25 feet north of the current church, just so you know where it was. I love that they add the 50 cents. I think it's kind of cute. But anyway, all right. Oh, just to make sure I have a picture. Oh, so that's what it looked like. Okay, so you know. And a little thing. Okay, and then in 1856 they decided to build the current one. It's interesting because the water had to be hauled from the river at 5 cents a barrel. And people had to push the rock and lime up a long incline in single wheel carts. I'm going to show you a picture in a second. But I do want to know, just emphasize also that the altars were carved in 1890 by Francis Hirscher. He was blind while he was building that, which is really so interesting. That's an interesting thing. You know the Deering family? Some of you know the Deering family? That's their relative back from there. So it's just kind of interesting. So here's what it actually, where they're building it. They have to have this little thing, they have to go up and down on a little thing. It's just so interesting, because I always wonder, how did they build such a big church with, that was a long time ago, but apparently they did. And so here's what it actually then looked like. At that time, it was like this. Here's the old church here, okay? Here was the new church. This one eventually will take down, and they'll build up on this one also. okay? And the only other thing that's really interesting is that there's a father, Sabs, I think is it Sabs? I don't know how to say that, okay. He arrived in Shakopee in 1917. He had taught the Habsburg children, and this was in Austria. And they commissioned a windows for the church pre-World War I. When the war started, World War I, they took those stained glass and they buried them so they wouldn't get destroyed. And after World War I, there was a real depression. So they took those things and they were cheap. So Father Sab says, we'd like to buy them. And so he bought them for here. Okay, and so they're still there there now. So there you have what it looks like. And of course you're familiar obviously with the, there was a big fire that happened here in Shakopee a few years ago and they had to redo the whole thing too. So it's just interesting. All right. The German Evangelical Lutheran Church was built in 1859. Do you know where that is now? Which one is that one?
That little red brick church down on East Ridge Avenue.
Yeah, it's the one that's the Atlas Staffing, I think is what it is, right? Yeah. Okay. The Atlas Staffing is what it's now called. But I always thought that would be such a fun building to have as a house, because it'd be so fun. But anyway, now it's the staffing. All right. We know that the Lutherans conducted services starting in 1859. It was organized in 1860 with Reverend Blummer or whatever, okay. And it was incorporated, in 1862, it was incorporated as the German Evangelical Lutheran Church of Shakopee. So just like what was happening in the Catholic Church at St. Mark's, they spoke German. So the church, the service itself were in German in both this church and the Catholic Church. Okay, people used to call it the St. John's Lutheran Church. That was another way that it was called. And the first structure itself was built on 2nd Avenue. And when there was this big fire in 1872 that destroyed, I think, about $100,000 worth of the railroad tracks area, when that happened, that church was right there too. And you know, the fire was there, and the people who were there would use snowballs and throw them on the roof. And that stopped it from being destroyed, which is so interesting, okay. Then they moved it, in 1873 they moved it to 1st Avenue. And then eventually it was a frame church at that point, and they demolished it and did the brick structure, which was dedicated in 1890, and that's the one that's there now. And they switched from the synagogue, I don't know how to say this. Thank you, that. Has switched around a little bit within that. But it's interesting that then for 63 years they were in that church. And then at some point the brick church, they left, okay? And we'll talk about what happened with them. But meanwhile, it became the Assemblies of God congregation, same place. Then it became the United Methodist congregation until the 1980s. And now it's Atlas Staffing, okay? And that church, right next door, they had a school, and they spoke just German in the school. And that church is now at the Landing in Shakopee, so you can actually see it, what it looks like. In fact, when I went there recently, I was telling the woman there, who was like being like the teacher, I said, why aren't you speaking German? I said, you know, they were speaking German there, they weren't speaking English. And that is true, but she didn't take my suggestion yet. But I do believe they should, because they need to show that that was very important. Okay. It's also interesting that in 1932, they switched specifically to called it St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, but English became the language there. That was in 1932. So there was a lot of time where they just spoke German, okay? And in fact, they said that German still was used through the 1940. And meanwhile, they built a new church, okay, when the one that was there, still there, but now they built a new one on 8th and Fuller Street in 1853. And then they added an educational building later too. And so that's St. John's Lutheran Church. And I think I just took this picture recently so they can see that it's still there. All right. All right, the next one that comes along is the Church of the Immaculate Conception. And that was built in 1864. Do you know which one that one is? St. Mary's, right? Okay. It was called the Church of the Immaculate Conception until 1876, and then it was changed to St. Mary's. And again, what was happening was we had St. Mark's, which is only 3 blocks away, I think, okay? But they were speaking German mostly in the church, right? And there were more Irish people and French people who were there, and they didn't like the German sermons. And so then they purchased 3 lots for $200 in 1865, and for $7,000 built the building in 1866, okay? They added the belfry and steeple also. Okay. And just look, you know, how it looks then, how it looks now too. It's just kind of interesting. And here I just kind of like this picture. And you know, those are school kids going to school when they were at St. Mary's. It's interesting, when St. Mary's was built, they had that. It was free if you go to school there. So a lot of people from St. Mark's who went to school in St. Mark's moved there for school at St. Mary's because it was free. Even though they still were St. Mark's people. They totally, you know, they were still St. Mark's, but it was the Depression time, right? And they knew that this is free. You know, if you were stuck and they had, you know, 6, 7, 8, 9 kids, it was a lot easier to move there where it's free. Okay. Eventually, they started paying it too. Eventually, but that's just kind of interesting. Okay. Now, the Methodist Episcopal Church was 1867. And the church was built in 1867 between Somerville and Spencer Street and 3rd Street. Okay? And they do say that the church was hit by lightning a few times and damaged with fire. And also kind of interesting that there was someone who was in the church who was charged against a member, accused of secretly taking up a calf, as in a cow, and concealing the fact with the idea of making money off the whole thing. And he also, I can't say that word.
Disagreed.
Yes, the Sabbath. Okay. In my head it makes sense, but I can't say it out loud. All right. So, and he was found guilty and was suspended from grace while awaiting repentance. It's interesting because I haven't found out more what happened afterwards, you know, whatever happened. But anyway, we do know that in 1881, they decided that the church was going to be closed. Okay, And so it was just left empty, probably about 30 years, I think. And then what happened is the Bloomington Ferry Methodist Church, which met on Old Shakopee Road in Bloomington. And the Shakopee people said, here's our church, you want it? Okay, as a kind of a gift for them. And so they did, and they actually put it on the Minnesota River and sent it up to West Bloomington. It's interesting because one of the reasons why they do that is because of the power lines, you know, on the streets, whereas on the river they didn't have that problem. Okay, and they said that it took 10 or 12 teams of horses to pull the building down and put them on rollers. They think that it was done on ice, but they don't really have no written documentation about that. But we do know that it was in 1899. They moved it to what's called Bloomington Ferry Church, starting in 1900. And they were there until 1970. Then they merged with another church, okay? And so the church was then moved again, this time back to Shakopee. And they put it in the landing, okay? So they was moving along the river. You can see it's not the best picture because it's from a newspaper, but it said it's a 20 by 50 foot church standing 50 feet tall and weighed 50 tons. And a crane moved the church onto a barge. It was a 190 feet barge. And then it moved to the landing in Shakopee. And now you can see it. There it is. So if you go to the landing, you can actually see the church. So it's really the Shakopee Methodist Church, as well as the Bloomington Ferry Methodist Church that's now in the landing. So it's just kind of interesting, the tie-ins that go in with that whole thing. All right. And then finally, I think the last one we have to really talk about is the Mount Olive Lutheran Church in 1852. There's not a lot of information I found so far, but I do know that they did have this place, and then they moved on at 1205 10th Avenue East. In other words, it's the one that is now the Russian church that you hear about now, right? Okay, but actually what happened is that they had like a prefabricated building, and it arrived, it was 15 tons, and the 2 trucks brought it, and the men of the church, notice they never say the women, so I guess the women just sit back and watch the men do the work, I guess. I'm just saying, that's what it says, all right? Okay, they put it together, you know, and they said it was about 35,000, but the men, again, men, they say, did all the work. I would love to find out if someone would really find out if there were some women doing some stuff to probably work. But we do know that it was about a 60 by 24 foot L-shaped structure, okay? And they said it held about 102 people with an overflow room of 78. And it was dedicated in 1956. And it continued there until they moved to Marystown Road, okay? And here's the pic, what it looks like. Okay, so that's there now. But what happened to the old church became the Slavic Baptist Church, starting in 1998. They purchased the former building, which at that time was part of the school district, because it was right next to Pearson School, okay? And it had been used as Assembly of God. And the congregation there, and it's really popular, I think on Saturday is one of their main services, I think, okay? But the people are Russian, Ukrainian, and others. See how you do that? Okay, that's really bad, but okay. But you know, if you've seen, it's a really interesting thing. And then in 2001, they added on. So it's that big. And we also know that they do teach Russian to the children as like a separate thing that happens there all the time, because their concern is that when they do their service, it's usually in Russian. But they also want to make sure that the children who basically go to Shakopee schools are mostly speak English, and they don't want to lose the language. And so they have a regular, like I think, a regular service, and they have a school for those people. Okay? And they say about 400 adults and 300 children attend the school. Okay, so that shows the expansion that was going on there. And so now you have this with the expansion beyond that to there. Okay? And we do know, just generally, that today in Shakopee, there are at least 22 churches. So the ones we've showed are not all of them, obviously, but these are the ones from the early stuff, okay? It continues on, there's a lot more that go on. But we do know that there are a lot that are still coming up. Okay? All right, any questions or comments about churches in early Shakopee? Yeah.
Well, a lot of these church buildings started right in the midst of really upwards.
Yeah.
Was there any part of the church that was really upwards?
Yeah, St. Mark's especially was when the uprising happened, they decided at that time the church was not built yet, only, well, part of it, I think it was, I want to say 6 feet tall. I'm not sure the 6 is right, but it was around there so much when it happened. And they ended up using that as like a fortress. And they had a cannon, and they were all ready because they thought it was going to happen right here in Shakopee. It's interesting because now there's a lot of discussion, like online, what happened to the cannon. And there's a lot of, someone believes it was buried somewhere in Shakopee. And some people believe that, no kind of thing. But I do know that part was a big part of that. So that was in terms of St. Mark's was very involved. The reason why it was because they were building the building there because they were hoping to be a university in Shakopee. And that was kind of what the plan was. They were going to do a university there. St. John's, in Collegeville. Well, before it became there, they were hoping it was going to be here in Shakopee. But then the bishop turned it down, and so they were stuck with it. And that's why it was sitting there for a while. And that's when then the war happened. So it's just kind of interesting that. Weird, actually, but it's just interesting. And it's too bad because it would have been nice if we had had a nice college in town, too. But anyway.
We will.
We will, yeah, we will. I'm sure at some point, you're right. It's a little bit of everything. And as you know, if you go down in town now and you just go down any of the roads, going south, it used to be, when I was growing up, I think 9th, Shakopee Avenue was kind of the end of town, right? And then there was like corn and stuff here, right? And then slowly it was moving this way and this way, and it's interesting. Then they added the high school on 10th Avenue, so that was a big change from they had to move up to there. And now it's up to 17th Avenue, but it goes way beyond that. But if you drive in some of those roads there, you'll see all kinds of other churches that are there. So, there's a lot more there, as well as you head towards Southbridge area, and you see other churches. So there are other ones around. And of course, even when you talk about, like for the Catholics, they had St. Mark's, they had St. Mary's, they had St. Mary's in Marystown. But then they've now kind of combined them together, but everybody still calls it the same thing because that's what they're doing. And there was kind of a little bit of a rival. And I remember growing up, I went to St. Mary's to school, and they had St. Mark's. And it was a rival, like when we played basketball, they, St. Mark's were the Lions, and St. Mary's was the Hornets. I don't know how they got there. But I just remember that we used to have, I was thinking about it because it was March 17th, and that was such a big Irish day. And so people would wear green to kind of show them. But then I remember we were German, but we went to St. Mark's, so we were like trying to decide if we should wear an orange shirt or and people would pinch you and the whole thing. So I just remember that part. Eventually, towards some point, must have been 8th, 7th, 8th, no, 6th grade, 5th grade, I guess it was, my 5th grade. They consolidated, that's when it became SAPS, and then moved around and then continued on from there. So it's just interesting, the different changes that happen over time. And it's just good, I think the most important thing is that the history is really important to remember that what happened in the process and to document that, because we want more people to know what happened in the past, because that helps with the future.
David, did
Yes.
Town have a full for school too, to the 8th grade?
Yes, it did.
Because I think it was still there when we came to town.
Yes, and it also when the consolidation happened, that's when they took it away completely from there. Yeah, and there were some really interesting stories about people who were with the nuns that were there. They had fun. Not fun, but for me it's kind of funny. But anyway, I have a couple of nuns in my family, so I figure I can say that. The final thing, on your paper, on this paper, if you turn back, if the one has a yellow circle on it in the back, anybody else? Oh, you got it, okay. You get a book.
Whoa. How about that car, too? Isn't there a car involved or something? Free car?
Okay. No. So and then the last thing is that the next thing that we're coming up is a place for women, the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee, and that will happen on Tuesday, April 17th, here again. And then there's others you can see on that list, so you know kind of what's going on. And feel free, it's free, and if you're lucky, you might win something each time, because we always do that. And again, it's from the Shakopee Heritage Society, and that's a little different, just so you know, from the Scott County Historical Society. Scott County is the bigger thing of the whole county, and this is specifically to Shakopee. And the Shakopee Heritage Society, their website is shakopeeheritage.org, and they have more other information on there. And this presentation, they videotape them, so that those will be online also, so that if you want to or show somebody else or something, it'll be on there too. Okay? Have a good day now.
One thing. At one time was a courthouse annex building before the bus.
Oh, I didn't know that part, so let's go and add that in.
The commissioners would meet and the administrator. And here's to buy your license.
All right, I'll add that in.
Well, now they're making it.
That was great. Thank you, David.
Okay, yes. 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 Yeah, you do.